So now I'm going to come to take your question seriously about democracies and the quest to net zero. And now let's come to some inconvenient facts. I think that what we've encountered to date is this, at least a kind of stripes of progressive thinking with which I associate myself, that we can get to net zero in a just transition way and do so in a way that offsets pre-existing inequality and builds economies from the bottom up. And if we do so, we can build durable coalitions of voters who will support net zero, but also feel as though they're getting a fair deal from that. And if that's not true, then look at the elections that are going to occur next year, both in the United States and the United Kingdom, and see that the battle lines around this question are already drawn. So, and the trick with that is that I think the green transition is not generating as many jobs, at least in electorally salient timeframes, as we hoped it might. And I think that's a conundrum for progressive Democrats who want to conjoin economic equity with the net zero transition. And I'd love you to unravel that for us.
Well, I'm not, you see, I work for the Financial Times, so obviously I'm not a progressive Democrat in your terms. If I were, I don't know what I would work for, not I think the Guardian anymore, but anyway, I wouldn't be working for the Financial Times. So I will phrase this in a different way. You want to achieve a just, energy efficient, climate safe, democratic world. And my answer to that is, you'll hate this, I mean, whoever created the universe didn't make plans for us to get everything at once, and particularly not in a timetable of about the timetable of 10 or 15 years. So I think you're going to have to make some choices, chum, and they're going to be quite difficult ones. So I would see it in this way. Let's assume for the moment that our priority, let's assume, is to put us on this green path pretty soon. And it is, and then you have to ask what you need to get there. Okay, so this is goal, means. So all these other objectives for the moment fall under the means category. My view has been there are two necessary conditions. They're very, very difficult. The first is a technological means that allows us to do this without actually reducing the standards of living of the world and the hopes of higher standard of living of the poorer parts of the world by dramatic amounts. Because my view is there isn't the slightest chance of that happening. So I'm going to put this to one side, but I think the sort of degrowth idea is fun, but it has nothing to do with what's going to happen in the world. So the first thing is the possibility of operating an economy which isn't wildly different from ours in its productive system with a completely new energy system, which is itself a staggeringly ambitious project. And what I would say is, having followed this reasonably closely from outside for 20 years, compared with where we were when my friend Nick Stern wrote his climate report, which was so seminal, it's clearly the most important thing the Blair Brown governments did, is that the general view of people engaged in this is that technology, the productive system of energy, has improved from our point of view far faster than anyone really believed would happen. So this has been a big boon, and we owe a lot of that, and I think I've written that one, to the Chinese. And the result of that is, just been writing a column about this, which will appear in our COP28 special issue, that from a technological point of view, it all looks much more plausible. Unfortunately, the time left to make it happen has been reduced spectacularly, so we have to go much faster than what might have been the case if we'd had all these means 20 years ago. And that gets to the second thing, which is the politics of all this. And essentially we have to do, and this is where my column ends, so I would say, there are essentially two gigantic political tasks, and I'm much better at defining the task than giving the solution, because that's why I didn't go into politics. And but I can say that not many people have come up with it. You have to create a politics which convinces a pretty sizable proportion of the population, and more than half, enough that people will stick with it when it gets difficult, because it will, that it's not going to deprive them of features of their lives and hopes for the future that matter to them. And this, as a matter of fact, is far more important in emerging and developing countries than in developed countries, because, as I'm sure you know, already about 2/3 of the emissions in the world are generated by the emerging and developing countries, and all the growth is going to come from there. So that's where the politics really bite, and where the politics have hardly started. This is, I mean, I won't go into all the detail. That itself, this, if you like, the complex domestic politics of this, which are obviously going to be redistributional in important ways, are going to be very, very, very difficult. And a lot of the resources to make this possible are going to have to come, inevitably, from the better off in our societies, who are not going to go happily. And the second and even more difficult part of this, I think, than that, is where the politics is central, which is the global politics, which, because nobody's going to do anything really, really dramatic if everybody else isn't. I mean, that's pretty obvious. There are too many free riders in the system. Now, the number, I mean, there are lots and lots of countries who won't make much difference, so you don't have to get everybody on board. But you do have to get, at the very least, all the G20 on board, and particularly all the really big countries. And for some of them, these choices are really very, very painful. So I won't talk about China, I'll talk about India, which is a country I know. They've got a lot of discussion of this now. They would like to do this. There is a tiny elite group who are really keen on doing this, but the country is going to grow at 6 or 7% a year, and it's going to have to fit in that envelope, because if they don't do that, the politics will explode. So those are the two necessary conditions, and they're difficult enough. In fact, they're basically impossible. But I see the question you've asked as, what do we need to do as a minimum to sell the proposition to our publics domestically and globally? And at the moment, it would be fair to say, really, I think, no significant power has managed to do that.
As you know, the Port Talbot Steel project, just rescued by a combination of Tata investment and UK government additional subsidies, which could, if you were an optimist, form the backbone of, you know, the last bits of the UK steel industry and help revive EVs, and an important part of the industrial, the last vestiges of the industrial project in this country. There has been a fight about whether it will, as they green the steel, whether it will lose 2,000 jobs or not lose any jobs, but not create jobs.
Of course so.
The latest report out of Scotland on UK's wind production, a rather rosy report from the Scottish government saying by 2050 we anticipate that this is going to create 3,800 great jobs for Scotland, right? Last time I broke that down, that's kind of 300 jobs a month, which, if you think about what you need to do in order to create social equity, let alone offset the labor corrosive impact of AI and other stuff, it doesn't really give us. And if you look at the IRA, all the data on the IRA, perhaps the most remarkable piece of legislation that will give us a small chance of getting to net zero. But the labor-creating parts of the IRA are lagging behind the other forms of investment. And that's because the green transition is IP and capital and electron-intensive and not labor-intensive.
Well, this is all a colossal intellectual mistake. Energy production systems, which is what we're talking about, have always been, well, since the Industrial Revolution began, so it's now 230 years, well, they say 250 years ago or so, capital intensive, but capital intensive systems, and the new ones won't be any different. We moved out of very, very, labor intensive systems. The most labor intensive part of the energy production system we've ever had was mining coal. Sure. And it seems to me one of our great achievements is we got rid of it because it was an awful job. But the new versions, which will consist obviously of solar farms in colossal quantities, wind, possibly in the further future, fusion, maybe some other really subtle forms of energy capture, going through a highly automated and spectacularly efficient computer-controlled grid system backed up by batteries and so forth. This isn't going to employ anybody in the production of the energy. Slightly exaggerating. It will employ some people in making this stuff, but not many. And this is the first point. The second point is even more important and fundamental, because this is a subset of a much bigger point, which is why this sort of romanticism about manufacturing jobs is a complete dead end. I think just about the safest prediction one can make about the future of our economies, assuming the end of the world doesn't happen, is that within 30, 40 years, nobody effectively in the world, and certainly nobody in the developed countries, will be employed making anything. So to give you a very crude statistic, in 1960, the roughly, it depends on the measure, 40 to 50% of the British labour force worked in industry. It's now 10, depends on how you divide, it's now 10. And the industrial sector has grown a lot. I mean, it hasn't grown, of course, in the way it did in China or so forth, but it's grown a lot. And the reason is this is incomparably the easiest sector in which to substitute human beings by machines. And that's not going to change. In fact, everything you just talked about is going to make that worse. So thinking that this is, of course, it's the romanticism that the Biden administration, that they are going to recreate industrial America. They're not. Even in China, the industrial sector as a source of employment is shrinking rapidly. So this is a dead end. What you need to think about is what we can do with hopefully free, cheap, clean energy. And lots of what we will do with free, cheap, clean energy is just live better lives. And most of the things that help us live better lives are actually services. So the service sector will explode in many ways, some of them wonderful and some of them are less so. But this idea that the green revolution will, as it were, directly solve our employment rate is just weird. It's just completely ahistorical.
Well, if it's not going to be the creation of millions of manufacturing jobs, and if at best what it's going to do is substitute it with a whole bunch of new whiz-bang service jobs, which in fact could be great jobs and better than manufacturing jobs in some ways, there will be a period of dislocation and disruption because they'll be with different people in different areas and different geographies requiring different skills. And what's pernicious about that is that at this moment, that group of people who will be dislocated and disrupted as our labor markets shift are people who will be electoral fodder for right-wing anti-green parties, of which you've seen Rishi Sunak articulate a view and Trump will articulate a view saying the green revolution is going to stop you flying, make you stop eating meat, take away your car, Ulez is going to disrupt you, the man with the van. And in some ways, as disingenuous and as odious those arguments are, they have a purchase. What? And it's what will happen to those people who are interested in a just transition is they will be pounding sand in the way that people didn't like Brexit will be pounding sand. So how could all of you people be so misguided to vote for something where you were sold a pup and you could be sold a pup a second time?
Well, I think that the arguments that, this is a profound difficulty. At best, we would substitute a dirty, costly energy system with a clean and with luck, somewhat less costly one. That's still an open question. And in the process, we will, if we were incredibly successful, I think the time is running out, do a lot about solving the climate problem. But they will still be electrons, and assume that they are for this process the same marginal cost. Let's assume, and the same average cost. That's not probably, on the basis of what we know now, colossally wrong, though it's probably a bit pessimistic. Then there's no reason why the rest of what's going on in our economy will stop going on. And the most important thing that has been going on in our economy our economies everywhere is industry continues to be very important, but is steadily becoming completely automated. Basically, as one of my friends pointed out 25 years ago in a particularly brilliant essay, it's just following the path of agriculture. So, you know, you could argue the greatest single economic transformation and social transformation in Britain, for example, is that in 1800, roughly, we don't know the statistic, 60 to 70% of the labor force worked on farms, and back-breaking labor it was, and now it's about 0.5%. Now, manufacturing is following the same path, and this is all going to go, and the factories of the future will just be run by robots. We made up for that, but that transformation created lots and lots of new jobs, and they were quite good jobs for a pretty significant proportion of the population, almost all of whom are highly educated, and we have immeasurably expanded the proportion of our population who go to university. And some of them, not enough actually, get pretty good jobs. But the people who lost their jobs in industry have, by and large, they're not wrong. The opportunities they've got on the whole were worse in many respects, less secure, less well paid, more precarious, I've said that, and on the whole, worse paid. We've hollowed out the middle. And this will be part of that. It won't reverse that. And the class divisions that go with that between the generally successful, well-educated people who think that we've got a reasonable future, and climate change is just going to be part of the solution, what we're going to do on this, and the gulf between that and people who think actually the economy isn't generating anything useful for me and my children, that gulf is going to grow, and that's the biggest. That's why my thesis in my book, that's a very large part of why it's not the only reason why our politics are blown up.